Hey there! Imagine this. You are sitting in the office, casually browsing Facebook, day as usual, and then your boss comes and asks you to ingest a new data source. So, how do you start? What questions do you ask? What should you focus on? Well, that's the topic for today, so let's get started. Alright, so today I would like to talk about all those things that you should think about when you start working on a new data source. So let's start writing it down. So data ingestion. How to start? And you will see that today I will talk about various questions, and obviously answers to some of them will make some other questions not valid anymore. So it will be up to you to choose the ones that make sense in your context. So the first thing I would ask, if I were to ingest a new data source, would be what type of source it is. So what type? And what do I mean by this? Is it a database? If yes, then what type of database? Is it a SQL Server? Is it a Oracle, MySQL, Firebird, or some other database? Basically, what database engine is being used here? Or maybe it is a file. Then, what type of file? Is it a CSV, JSON, XML, Parquet, Delta? Where this file is stored? Is it available in some SFTP? Is it stored in some storage account in Azure? Or maybe it's just sitting in some local server in the company office. So this what I would ask about. But maybe it's not a database, it's not a file, it's some API. And again, what type of API it is? Is it a REST API? Is it a GraphQL API that uses a different language to query this type of APIs? Is it some other type of API, maybe built in-house by some company, by some vendor? Or maybe this is an API exposed by one of those big players in the IT industry, like Facebook, or by Google, or by Microsoft maybe. So that's the first thing I would focus on, what type of source it is. Then I would ask, alright, but where is this data source located? Is it a cloud-based? Or is it stored in on-premises, cloud or on-prem? And why does it matter? Well, you saw during our talk about integration runtimes in Data Factory, assuming that you will be using Data Factory to ingest this data, and in many cases that's the good choice, you saw that not all integration runtimes can connect to on-premises data. So this information, it might impact your choice on which integration runtime to be used. Obviously, assuming that you are going to use ADF. And now, when I was talking about integration runtimes in ADF, I told you that self-hosted integration runtime is able to connect to on-premises data sources, and that's true. But there is one more runtime that can do this. That's the Azure Integration Runtime with managed VNet. It also can be configured in a way to connect securely to on-premises network. It requires some additional setup, like provisioning a standard load balancer, but it is possible. But anyway, this information is pretty important to you, where this data is stored. Then, is the data going to be pulled by us or pushed by the source? So pull or push approach. And what's the difference? Well, in case of pulling the data, it is us, our software, that connects to the data source and queries it or just grabs data that is exposed. So it is on us to initiate the whole process, to set the schedule, to connect, to grab the data. And that's how data factory works, because it is the one that connects to some data source, for example, using copy data activity, and then it is grabbing the data. In case of push approach, the situation is completely different, because it is the data source that pushes the data to us. Maybe it is some file that is uploaded to our solution in Azure. Maybe the solution is inserting data to a database. Who knows? Anyway, this information, whether it is a pull or push approach, again, is pretty important. The next thing I would focus on is what's the category of the data source or the processing. Is it a streaming data source or batch processing? And again, we didn't talk about streaming yet. So basically, streaming is when we have a constant flow of events, of data that we want to consume. Data is produced all the time. For example, heartbeat sensors in hospitals, or some IoT devices in a factory that measure temperature, or how fast the engine is running, or something like this. In case of batch processing, the one that we were discussing so far, we basically don't process data in a real time or near real time, like it is the case for streaming. For batches, we usually execute our processing once a day, usually during the night, maybe twice a day. But again, if your data source just is streaming the data, you can't use a batch approach. You have to use some other tools, some other techniques to ingest this. And we'll get back to streaming later on. For now, we are focusing entirely on batch processing. So the next question is, all right, so what should be the schedule of our ingest process? So ingest schedule. So assuming that we are going with the batch approach, so it is the process will be executed maybe a few times a day at specified time. But at what time? Well, we've got to remember that we don't want to disrupt our data source, because usually that's the system that is bringing money to the company. So it has to work no matter what. Our BI solution, our analytics solution, is usually less important. So it cannot cause any issues to the source. So it means that usually, in case of batch processing, we execute our batches at night, where the business users not work, so they won't see any impact on our processing. On the other hand, quite often, this time at night is used by those various source systems to execute some batch jobs, some processes, some nightly calculations that are quite heavy, and that's why they are scheduled at night, again, to not disrupt business users. It means for you that you should be aware if there is any schedule, any heavy lifting tasks running at the time, that when you would like to run your data ingestion process, to not disrupt this process. Secondly, you might need to wait for those nightly processes to finish, because you want to ingest this data that is the result of those processes. So again, you should be aware of those schedules, of those things that happen at the source. And one more thing, in case of global solutions, please be aware that your midnight might be a middle of the day in some other time zone. So think about this and try to find this sweet spot when the data is ready, And when you're ingesting it, you are not causing any issues to the source system or to the users. And it might be not that easy to find that point in time. Maybe even you will have to ingest your data like 3 times a day. So once will be ingested data for Europe, once for Asia, and once for Americas. Depends on your case. Now, the next important thing is the data source to which we are connecting under active development. Under development. And it happens quite often, especially for in-house built systems, that they are constantly being updated. They are being modified. New versions are released, which means that in the middle of your implementation, the data structure might change. So you should talk to the guys responsible for this data source and ask, are there any plans to modify this data source? If yes, maybe they can give you a roadmap when you might expect those breaking changes, if any. The same is quite often observed in case of those APIs exposed by global players, like Facebook, by Google, by Microsoft. For example, Facebook API, it is changing every few months. The same for Google APIs. They are constantly being developed and updated. And every now and then, a new major version is released that might introduce some breaking changes, which means that your beautiful ingest process one day might just fail because the structure of the data changed and the structure you are expecting is no longer supported. So you should familiarize yourself with the documentation, if there is, obviously, and the roadmap of given data source, and see when they are planning to make some changes. And then make sure that your product owner or project manager is aware of this. So even if you finish the development and your process is working just fine, then there has to be someone who will maintain this piece of the code to adapt it to the changes introduced by new versions of the source. All right, so let's move on. The next important question is, all right, once we know what type of data it is, where it is, how we are going to, when we are going to connect but actually how? How do we connect? How to connect to this particular data source? And again, it might require either reading the documentation, if it is available, or contacting the guys who know this data source. And here, what information you might need? Well, again, it depends on the type of the data source. For example, you might need an IP address to which you have to connect. You might need a port. You might need a protocol over which you want to connect. In the case of some web APIs, you will need URL, which we'll use to connect. In the case of databases, you will need the server name or the server instance. The same for database name. So basically, you have to know all these technical details that will allow you to connect. All right, but that's not it. Let's assume that you know that you need to go to a specific IP over some port using some protocol. But then quite often it will be the case that from networking point of view, this connection will not be possible. So networking is the next thing to ask about. So imagine this. If you are trying to connect to a data source that contains this precious data that is super valuable to the company, obviously it won't be exposed to the internet because no one does this, right? Hopefully no one. So you would have to check if there is this something called line of sight between the tool you want to use to ingest the data and the data source to which you want to connect. For example, from ADF to a database. And pretty much often there won't be this line of sight. There will be some obstacles down the road, like some firewalls. So it means that you might need to contact the networking team or database administrators or the guys that maintain the security in your company and ask them to whitelist some address or some IP on the firewall. So whitelist firewall. And again, it sounds easy, just whitelist some IP on the firewall. In real life, that's quite a complex process because those guys that are responsible for security, well, it's their job to secure the data. So they won't be that eager just to open it to some IP that you will ask about. No, you will have to usually prepare some documentation and explanation why this thing needs to be opened. They will ask you about some security related stuff that you most likely will have to provide. So basically, your solution might need a security audit. And only if it passes this audit, only then this firewall will be whitelisted. And it might take weeks, honestly. In bigger companies, this process is slow. So don't expect that you send an email today and tomorrow it will be done. Forget about this. And now, when you will be requesting them to whitelist some IP on a firewall, you have to provide them details, like what IP is to be whitelisted. And think about it on both sides. So one thing might be your company network from which the traffic is leaving to the source. And on the other hand, you've got the data source that is also protected by a firewall that protects the inbound traffic, that blocks the inbound traffic. So in both cases, you might need, for example, to provide them with the IP address used by Data Factory. And now you should know how to get this IP because we were talking about this last time. Or maybe they will tell, sorry, no way, we are not allowing a public access. You have to think of something else. And then it will be up to you to think which integration runtime in ADF can be used to connect in a secure way. And again, this process might take time. And it will. Alright. But let's assume that we've got this line of sight so we can see our data source from our ingestion tool, that the networking stuff has been completed. Great, so we are making some progress. So the next thing we should ask about or think about is security. Security. Mainly, how are we going to authenticate to the source? Because probably this data is not available to anyone anonymously. No, Probably we've got authenticate. Authentication. And I will talk about authentication and authorization in future episodes. For now, let me tell you that authentication is simply proving that you are who you claim you are. So for example, when I'm trying to connect to a database, I have to prove that it is really me, that it is Piotr who is trying to connect. And it might mean that, for example, you will need some kind of a user and password to connect. And someone will have to provide this information for you. So you will have to reach out to the guys who are able to provide those credentials for you. And again, in bigger companies, it might be not that easy to find that person who has the authority to create those new credentials for you. But maybe you are not using an user and password anymore because it might be considered not secure. And instead, maybe the data source, it requires an access token to connect. And that is quite often the case for various APIs. But in case of access tokens, well, they have their validity period. Which simply indicates for how long you can use this token to authenticate yourself. And usually, those access tokens are short-lived. Maybe they are valid for 1 hour or so. But what if your data ingestion process is longer than 1 hour? What then? How do you request this access token? Can it be automated in somehow? Usually, there is some API to get this access token based on refresh token. And again, it should be described in the API documentation. But that's something that you should think about. What if your refresh token is expired? How to obtain a new one? So that's the stuff that you would have to check. And then apart from authentication, which is proving that you are who you are, we've got authorization part. Authorization. And authorization simply means, all right, so what I can do in a given system, what am I allowed to do, what permissions were granted to me. And again, it's not on us to set this stuff. It will be someone on the data source side who will tell, all right, so you can read, let's say, this table, or you have access to this directory, or you can use this endpoint in the API. But you will have to make sure to ask for proper permissions. So again, you will have to know what type of data and what data exactly you will need. All right, and all those stuff, just to connect, it will take time. Obviously, in some cases, it's pretty obvious, pretty easy, but sometimes it will take quite a lot of time, which means that what I like to do in the case of completely new type of data sources is to create a very simple proof of concept, just to verify connectivity part. And now, it doesn't have to be perfect. It is a quick and dirty solution. Quick and dirty. And you can use, well, I use the tool that works for me. It might be a Postman in case of API requests. It might be some Python script. It might be some other tool that can be used to quite easily just try to connect to some data source and see if I have access, because that's the point of this POC, just to verify that I can connect from my environment to the data source. that I can grab the data. And now, once we confirm that yes, the connectivity stuff works, that the security is handled, that networking is configured, then you will proceed with creating this nice solution according to various design patterns that meets all the standards. But this POC is to quickly discover any issues, that maybe some firewall is blocking us and you will need to reach out to the security team. Or maybe the firewall works just fine, but the user that you were granted, that you were given, doesn't have permission to read from a table from which the data is to be read. All right. The next thing that is quite important to check is, are there any rate limits or throttling? Throttling. So what is this? Well, that's the thing that is quite often configured in case of APIs. So basically, just to prevent denial of service attacks, those APIs, they have a limit that tell you how many requests you can make, let's say per minute. So number of requests per minute, or how much data you can grab, again per minute, just to prevent you just firing thousands of requests within 10 seconds and then causing issues to some other customers. And now those limits, they might be an issue for you, especially if your data that you are trying to grab is so huge that you are exceeding those limits, and you might need to introduce some artificial breaks, delays between your requests to make sure that your requests are not just killed, right? But this is something that you'll read in the documentation if it is available. And then you'll have to experiment, maybe using this POC, to see how many requests you need to read the data that you have to read, and how does it compare to those limits. Are you safe or are you close to the edge? And then you will have to think about it, how to make sure that you are not hitting those limits. All right, next thing is that, again, in case of APIs, it might be a synchronous data source or asynchronous one. And what do I mean by this? Well, synchronous source or request simply means that I want to grab the data. For example, you write a SQL query and then you receive the data back as a response. But in case of various APIs, it might be an asynchronous approach, which means that you send a request and as a response you don't get the data back immediately, but you just get, all right, acknowledged, we received your request, please come back in 5 minutes using this address and check if your data is ready. So then it will be up to you, up to your process, in case of asynchronous processing, to periodically ask the source, is my data ready? Is my data ready? And finally it will be ready, and then just process it further. So again, this is something to take into consideration. Next, in case of APIs and the big data responses, usually the data is not sent as a whole in one response. Let's say you want to grab 100 megabytes of data from Web API. There's no way you will receive this in one go. No. The response will be split into multiple pages, multiple responses, and then based on the API and how it is implemented, you will have to go and ask for every page of the data, of the response, separately. So your process will have to be smart enough to understand that pagination might occur, and then how to iterate over those pages to grab the whole response, and then somehow combine it into a one response. The next thing, quite important, is, especially if you want to use ADF, is this data source supported by data factory? So data factory out of the box, it has many connectors to many services out there, and usually you will be able to connect using data factory, but sometimes you won't. And in such cases, you would have to find a different tool that is able to do this. Or maybe data factory can connect, but there is another tool that does it better and in a simpler way. And one of the most commonly used examples is just downloading a file from SharePoint. We can do this using data factory just by crafting the web request. But if we used a logic app, which has a native connector, it becomes much easier. So that's something that you should check. Is the data source you are trying to connect to, is it supported by data factory? And if yes, how easy it is to use this data source. And now, please remember that all the stuff that I am talking about today is only about the data ingestion part. That's our point of focus, just to grab the data as it is and just dump it in a data lake. I'm not trying to understand in depth the data source, because it's not that area yet. Once we get to the transformation part, to the business logic, then yes, then we'll have to know exactly what every column, what every field means. But just to ingest the data, this knowledge is not that important. It would be great if you know this already, but at this phase, it's not that critical. All right, so let's move on. So the next important thing to consider is how much data there is. How much data? So why does it matter? Well, think of it like this. If you have let's say a database as a source that has a huge table with terabytes of data, probably you won't be ingesting the whole table every day, because it won't be possible to do. There is too much data. Which means that in some cases, you will have to load data incrementally instead of fully. So incremental or a full load. And incremental load simply means that instead of loading everything every time, you're just loading a small part of it, that you somehow decide which part should be loaded. Maybe that's last 7 days, maybe last month of data, or maybe that's the data that changed since the last time you ingested it. Now, in case of incremental data, incremental loads, if you will have to do them, then alright, but how can I detect the changes? Maybe there is some native option available, like change data capture, that you can enable on the data source, just to tell you explicitly, hey, that's the data that has changed since the last time you queried the data source. Maybe there is some date, like modified date, that indicates when some value, some row or some file was modified, and you could use this date to detect changes. Maybe this data source has some incremental ID. Maybe it has some ID that is constantly increasing, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, every time a new row is added, and you can use this ID just to see what rows were added in the meantime. Or maybe in case of APIs, you are able to provide a date range, like today minus 7 days. And that's the range for which data will be returned. So you'll have to know if any of those methods can be used in case of your data source. Now, the next important thing is, alright, if we are going with the incremental load, it probably means that there is a huge amount of data to be processed. That's why we don't want to do it fully every day. But incremental load, as the name suggests, it will load only those daily changes. So how about the initial load? That will load the data fully. It will be a one-time operation just to grab this baseline, and then we'll use the incremental loads from there. But how to do this initial load? And please remember that we don't want to disrupt the data source, but we will have a huge amount of data to be loaded. So how do we do this? And please remember that you don't have to use the same approach, the same tools, the same methods for incremental and this initial load. Maybe it will be more suitable in your case to use some script to do the initial load. Or maybe just grab a hard drive from your data center and physically move it to some other place and load it. Or maybe some other way that might not be that beautiful, but you will get the job done without disrupting the data source. Then the next important thing is, alright, but if there is, let's say, this modified date field available, or this incremental ID, but can we use it? Can we query the source? Can we query the source? And then in our query, simply use those fields to get the data we need. Maybe we can't, and simply we receive a file with data, and that's it. So again, that's quite important to check. All right, so next, what we should check is what type of data it is. So what data is it? And now, at this moment, we don't have to have a full understanding of every column. Not yet. But this general knowledge about this source is important. So you might want to classify it under, let's say, master data, like list of customers, list of products. Or maybe you know already that it is a transactional data source. Transactional, which simply translates to a fact later on. And for both of those types of data, you might already have some patterns developed by your company that you should follow. So classifying the data into one of those categories is quite important. Then is this data special in any way? Is it special? And what do I mean by this? Well, for example, does it contain PII data, this personally identifiable information, that due to law regulations, it might require some special processing? Maybe the data you are trying to ingest is highly confidential. So it's super secret, which means in turn that it might require some super tight security, which in turn might mean that for this type of data, you just cannot use the same process you used for the regular data sources, and you have to do something more secure, more advanced. So again, that's something to be checked. Then, is there any historical data that has to be loaded from this source? And usually, or maybe not usually, quite often there is. So you've got this nice system that produces the data that you have to ingest, but apart from that, they have the data from the previous version of the system. But the system is no longer available. We cannot extract the data from it anymore, but they have it as files, let's say. But does this historical data differ? Does it differ from the data that we have from the newest version of the system? And usually it differs. So it might mean that you should treat this historical data as a completely new data source. So don't forget that, all right, they have this shiny data source, but apart from that, they've got this lump of data just stored in this directory that they also expect you to ingest. All right, let's move on. What you would need else is data specification. So for example, in case of files, you might need the stuff that we were talking about in one of the previous episodes, like encoding, column delimiters, text qualifiers, date format, culture, and so on. So this stuff you've got to get. Then, ideally, what you might ask up front, the data source, is to get some sample data. Like just some files, some extracts. Just for you to be able to look at this data and see, all right, so it contains this email address, which is a PII data, which might trigger some additional questions. Or you might see, all right, so we've got this modified date column in this extract, and you would ask, all right, can we rely on this column that every time the row is updated, then the value of this date is also updated, and so on. Then you will need to have someone on the other side that knows this data source, that is able to answer all those questions you will have. And actually, it might not be even a single person, but multiple. So there might be a single person that knows the technical details, knows how to connect, how to authenticate, how to authorize. And there might be some other person who knows this data, who can explain you what it means. And finally, maybe actually this data source was already loaded by your company. Is it already loaded? Already loaded. And what do I mean by this? Well, let's say that you were given a task to load a new table from a database. But maybe you already have a process that loads different tables from the same database. So the majority of the job is already done. You just need to add this new table. But all the security stuff, the networking, is most likely already handled. And finally, what should be important to you is, are there any frameworks? Used by your company that you should use. So maybe no, you cannot use ADF or a Logic app because your company decided to use this software to ingest all of this data, just to be consistent across various projects, across various data sources. So it's not up to you to decide which one you want to use, and you have to follow the company guidelines. All right, so that was it. Obviously, this list is not complete, is not exhaustive. Questions depend on your business case, what type of data you have to deal with, but at least it should help you to get started. It should help you to realize all the things that you should think about, that you should ask. It should help you to plan various steps in advance, just so you won't be blocked by someone on the security team, because they will need 2 weeks to open a firewall. So that's it. I hope it was useful. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Take care.